anticipated, and then they have to reevaluate.
Great.
Scale back.
Yeah, scale back.
Yes.
And we have to do that a lot of times in our project. And sometimes we do have to scale back a little bit because it's over budget, it's not feasible, we're not able to do it in the time frame, or we don't have the necessary skill set or resources, be it people or time, in order to do those things.
So, like I said before, that I touched on, like, maybe something you didn't identify, but it's within scope and has to be done, otherwise you cannot complete the project, you gotta keep it. But for like this, something that's within scope, but you start learning that it's not feasible because of timeline, or it was costing more than you thought, then you may need to take it out then,
Exactly,
right?
exactly. Yeah, it's highly possible.
Yeah.
And it's a tough situation. And in the planning phase and in the execution phase, we'll talk a little bit about that. Actually, in the planning phase, we'll talk a little bit about that, because sometimes what you have to do is you have to go back to the sponsor and negotiate with them and say, hey, you know, either can we have more resources, or can we have more time, or we have to scale back on some things.
LaShonda, I just wanted to mention something real quick, that oftentimes in project planning, the leader or the person initiating the project oftentimes don't really think the project out, because if you think it out, you know everything that you have to have included in that project, and sometimes it doesn't happen and you incur things, oh my gosh, I didn't think about this, I didn't think about that. You have to think about everything about that project before you can successfully plan it.
I agree. And you know what, Alfirma, that is a great segue into our next phase, which is planning. On page 10, it actually will begin to talk a little bit about what we call the 3 Ds of planning. The 3 Ds of planning is define, then you design it, and then you develop it. 20% of the total project's duration should actually be spent in this phase. And when you think about a project, you need to spend a good hefty time on the front end, making sure that you define the project, that you design the project, and that you also begin to think about those developments. I think, as Alfirma said, really begin to think about what are the step-by-step, what are resources, what are things that have to be done. So in this define stage, it's very important for the project definition, it's very important in order for the project to be successful, you have to define it. So the success of a project is very important in this define stage. In this stage also, it allows the organization to efficiently utilize limited resources. And I think that's the point that Miguel had made earlier. A lot of times there are so few resources, or you only have so many staff that you can allocate, or people, staff, resources, however you want to look at it, to a project. And so you have to be really, really mindful of that. And then also at this point is a time to gain or define consensus, or getting consensus or agreement. A lot of times when we think about, and I'm looking at Linda because Linda knows Linda, what are your thoughts? Because I know you're thinking about something.
Well, because a lot of times you get it all planned and then you realize there wasn't consensus after the fact, and things change.
Yes. Yes.
A few times.
Yes. So you can really see how defining that and gaining the consensus and agreement with those who are on the team is very important for this phase. In the design phase, this is where you want to bring in all of your stakeholders. So just thinking about your project, whether it's a project that includes professional development, you have to think about content writer, media writers, you have to think about information technology, you have to think about all these different players. You know, not only them, you have to also consider your funders, who you are sponsors, who you are accountable to, and making sure that it's aligned. This is also a point within project management that you want to make sure that you clearly articulate what's in scope and what's out of scope. Because this is where you get scope creep. You just have things that bit by bit, they get added and they get added. And so a lot of times what you'll find project managers doing is that they'll consistently go back to how does this align with the scope of work. And then, you know, the other thing that we have to consider is that this is an iterative process. So there are some times, as Linda said, where things do change and people are aware of the change and knowing that, okay, we got to go back, we got to tweak some things. But this is a process during this design phase where there will be some changing and there will be some changes along the way. During the development stage, you have to really make sure that you've allocated the appropriate resources. Time, money, supplies, materials, everything is in place so that the next phase of this project will be successful. This is also a time where the schedule is made, so you have an overall schedule about what it is that you want to accomplish. But then also there are individual instructions that you may give to those who are a part of this team. And then all matters must be clear for the team to carry out the implementation. You know, if the instructions, if you don't know where you're going, remember you got to begin with the end in mind. You don't know where you're going, hasn't been clearly defined, you haven't thought about the design of it. In order to develop it, you know, others aren't able to develop it. So these are very, very important aspects of project management. Any questions or comments about the planning phase and the 3 Ds of planning?
Seems like this is where a lot of projects go wrong.
Yes.
In this phase. Because you don't plan everything out and then you continue and then you realize that you didn't plan it. So
Yeah.
you have to go back to that planning stage
Exactly.
over and over.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this is where a lot of, like you said, a lot of things can go wrong. You know, think about if you were taking a trip somewhere. My son and I last year, we took a road trip of the South. And so we had everything mapped out. I knew that I wanted to get from Houston to Atlanta and go to Florida and back to Houston. So I had to have a road map and I had to think about each of those steps. What would be involved? What resources? Which direction we would go? Just think if I would have gotten on I-45 north and we're going to Florida. I would have gone somewhere. In Florida. So those are the kinds of things we have to think about with our project. We have to really know what the end is, think about all the steps and how we're going to develop our plan in order to get there. So what do you think would be some benefits of using project management? We talked this project management process. What would be some benefits? And on page 11, yes, on page 11, you have a couple of items, and we've talked about project deliverables or scope of work. These are actually those individual tasks. Everything that a person needs to do. Tasks, assignments, action steps, those types of things. Also begin to talk about like what are the delivery dates. You've identified what resources are needed for each of those tasks. So considering that, what would be some benefits of taking the time to actually do that work? What are some benefits of that?
You're going to eliminate waste, whether it's a waste of human resources or monetary resources.
Yes.
And time.
Eliminate
Time.
waste,
Yeah.
yes. And time, not being wasteful of time. Greg, was there some other things you wanted to add to that?
Well, it's just a standard or a plan that everyone can be called back to, kind of a home base.
Yeah.
To okay, and feel more secure instead of like, what do we do next?
Yeah. So a point of reference for people, always
Yeah,
bringing them
right.
back to what is the goal, what is our objective? Perfect. What are some other benefits or advantages of going through this process?
Well, you can keep focus on the project, on the tasks that have to happen in the project to make it possible.
Great. Keeping focus on the task and the project at hand. What would be some disadvantages of going through this process? Time. So you can see how time can be of a benefit, but also it's time consuming.
But it's worth it.
But it's worth it. Yeah, it's worth it. You do a lot of this on the front end. It's worth it. What are some other disadvantages?
Well, so I think sometimes it's hard to get consensus on your team.
Yes. Yeah, sometimes it's hard to get consensus. So what does, tell me a little bit more about that. What makes that a disadvantage?
But you have to spend time and effort building that consensus, and depending on the project manager's leadership skills, that process can take a short time or can take forever, and you run out of time.
Yes. Great comments, yeah. So, and that's true. How many of us have experienced that? Either getting to consensus really quick, or it's taking a little while to kind of get everyone on board and feel like, we can agree with some things and move forward. Yeah. Some other things, disadvantages?
You are working with a lot of different personalities, and so that could make it challenging too to come to that consensus, and so therefore taking a lot of time to get there. But
Yeah.
You have to commit the time
Commit the time.
for all stakeholders to be involved, so you can come to consensus.
Yes, that is correct. Spending that time up front to get everyone involved so you can create that consensus. Exactly. Earlier we were just talking about, time and whether or not it was feasible. And in your handout here, I noted that the most common problem that is discovered at this point is the timeline. It's usually after you plan it out and you go step by step and you think about all these variables, you think about how you're like, okay, either we're not going to meet the timeline, it's going to cost more than we anticipated, or you're going to get less than what you really wanted. And those are some of the things that you have to think about with your sponsor. Later on in the session, what I'll have at the end, actually at the end of your training manual, there are a couple of resources that you can use to begin to think about project management. I know a lot of us, and myself included, I've really been accustomed to my paper, and you will see me with my binders. However, there are some really great tools, some tools that we have access to, some tools that are fee-based that'll help you in this phase, and we'll talk a little bit about those later. Okay, so want to get to the execution. Execution is like the third stage or the third phase of project management. So far we've talked about initiation, we've talked about planning, and now we're going to talk about executing. And executing phase really is about leading the project. This is the phase where the project manager is bringing people together. I think as Tony said, to inspire them so that everybody is on one accord. So everybody knows exactly what is expected from this. This is the time for that project manager to come in and begin to do those things. It's also about managing people. So you have all of these subgroups, ad hoc groups who are doing different things, and it becomes about managing them. But then also it's about managing expectations. So a lot of times we talk about, here's the expectation. in our small group meetings or our bigger meetings, it either comes up as to do, or you may hear project management say, okay, so here's the expectation. So just knowing that this is part of the execution phase of it. I like to call this phase the fast and furious phase. Because that's actually what's happening. Everything is moving, everything is going. But as I think about really the phases of project management, it seems like a lot of times when we get projects, if you're a project manager, it's almost like you get the project on the tail end of planning, but then this is where you really are. How many would you agree? How many would agree? Yeah. So you can see a lot of times these other phases, you had nothing to do with those phases. Someone was already involved at that stage, and they've overlooked this huge area that Linda brought up, is about consensus and getting everyone on board, everyone part of that process. So as project managers, we have to begin to think about how we can become involved in the initiation phase, so that really we have an opportunity to be actively involved. You know, during this execution phase, this is where a lot of things are happening, a lot of things are going on. So on your page there, you have different types of communication. Communication is the key throughout this phase. As Linda said earlier, there are a lot of things that are happening. They're happening at a moment's notice. They're decisions made on the fly. And part of the project manager's role and responsibility is to make sure that everyone is aware of those changes. And on the next page, on page 13, you actually have a sample document. And if you guys would like this, I can actually send this to you in a Word document, share this with you. I think all of you have my email address, so I actually will send it out to you. But this is a sample communication plan, sample communication. And as you can see, it just talks a little bit about what are some of the outstanding or significant tasks that must be completed that week? What are the things that are coming up? And then what are some of the issues that has arisen? What are some of those things that have come up? This document is designed really to help make sure that your entire team, that they continue to have buy-in, that they feel included and a part of the overall project. Any questions? Do you have any questions? Right. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about what is it that a leader needs. So leadership is very germane to this execution phase, and I think either Greg or Miguel was talking about how important leadership is. If there was not a phase that is more important, it is in the execution. So what I want to do is on page 14, we are going to work together in a small group. And what I want you to do is there's a word or a group of words on the left side of the page, and then there are some statements that are on the right side. So what I want you to do, I want you to match up the word or the words with the statement. So for example, number 1 ensures that the project is defined properly